If you're watching this video, there's a strong chance you've already been marked. Not randomly, not accidentally, but specifically targeted by someone who recognized something in you that most people can't see. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called psychological type, the patterns that make certain people visible to predators while others remain completely invisible. And what he discovered should disturb you. Empathetic people don't just attract psychological predators, they radiate a specific energy signature that predators are neurologically wired to detect. This isn't about victim blaming. This isn't about telling you to be less empathetic. This is about understanding that your psychological gifts, the very traits that make you capable of deep connection, intuition, and emotional intelligence, also make you visible to people who hunt those exact qualities. By the end of this video, you'll understand the 5-stage hunting process that psychological predators use, why Carl Jung believed empathetic people are specifically vulnerable, and most importantly, how to recognize when you're being hunted before the trap closes. Because here's what Jung understood that most people miss. The hunt doesn't begin when the predator approaches you. It begins the moment they sense what you are. Part 1. The empath energy signature, what predators actually detect. Carl Jung didn't use the word empath the way we do today, but his concept of the feeling type person describes exactly what we're talking about. In his personality typology work, Jung identified people whose primary function is feeling, not emotion, but a sophisticated capacity to perceive and process the emotional reality of situations and people. Here's what matters. This isn't an invisible trait. It manifests in visible, detectable patterns of behavior that psychological predators have learned to recognize instantly. The 3 signals you're broadcasting. First, attentional patterns. Empathetic people make eye contact differently. They hold it longer. They look for micro-expressions. They're scanning for emotional data constantly. A predator notices this immediately because they're doing the exact same thing, but for different reasons. You're scanning to understand and connect. They're scanning to identify vulnerabilities and leverage points. Jung called this extroverted feeling, the tendency to attune to the emotional atmosphere of a room and respond to it. When you walk into a space and immediately sense tension or sadness or anxiety that no one has named aloud, you're exercising this function. And when you respond to it, even subtly, even unconsciously, you're revealing yourself. Second, response to boundary violations. Here's the test that predators run unconsciously, sometimes within the first 5 minutes of meeting you. They violate a small boundary and watch how you respond. They stand too close. They ask a slightly too personal question. They touch your arm without invitation. They interrupt you mid-sentence. Most people respond with immediate, clear boundaries. They step back, they give a clipped answer, they create social distance. Empathetic people do something different. They accommodate, they rationalize. They think, maybe they don't realize, maybe they're just awkward, maybe I'm being too sensitive. Jung understood this as the feeling type's dominant concern with harmony. The empathetic person's nervous system is designed to maintain relational connection, sometimes even at the cost of their own comfort. A predator detects this hesitation, this accommodation, and it registers as, this person can be pushed. Third, explanatory generosity. When someone behaves badly, empathetic people immediately generate compassionate explanations. They're probably stressed. They might be going through something. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. This is rooted in what Jung called the feeling function's capacity for subjective valuation, the ability to see situations from multiple emotional perspectives simultaneously. It's a profound gift. It allows for deep understanding, forgiveness, and connection. But to a predator, it signals something else entirely. This person will give me infinite second chances. Part 2. Stage 1. The approach, how predators test you. Carl Jung wrote extensively about what he called participation mystique, a French term he borrowed to describe a state of unconscious identification where boundaries between self and other become blurred. This is the first thing a psychological predator tries to create with an empathetic person. They don't approach you the way they approach other people. They approach you as if you already know each other. The familiarity tactic. Within the first conversation, they create an atmosphere of unusual intimacy. They share something vulnerable. They make an observation about you that feels uncannily accurate. They reference a shared interest, a shared value, a shared wound. Jung would recognize this as manufactured participation mystique. The predator is artificially creating the experience of deep connection that empathetic people naturally crave and respond to. Here's what's actually happening neurologically. Your mirror neurons are firing. Empathetic people have what neuroscience now confirms as more active mirror neuron systems. The brain structures responsible for empathy, emotional resonance, and social bonding. When someone shares vulnerability with you, your nervous system responds with oxytocin release, trust formation, and the desire to reciprocate. The predator knows this. They're not sharing vulnerability because they trust you. They're sharing vulnerability because they know you'll trust them in return. The boundary test. Remember what I said earlier about small boundary violations? This is where it becomes systematic. The predator will, within the first few interactions, violate your boundaries in small, deniable ways, and watch exactly how you respond. They show up unannounced. They ask to borrow something. They need a favor. They share more than is appropriate for the level of relationship you have. They text you late at night. They make a joke at your expense. Each of these is a test, and here's what they're testing for. Will you name the boundary violation, or will you accommodate it? Most empathetic people accommodate. We tell ourselves we're being flexible, open-minded, not uptight. Jung would say we're prioritizing the feeling function, maintaining harmony, over the thinking function that would allow us to make a clear, impersonal judgment. This behavior is inappropriate, and the predator notes this. They note it consciously or unconsciously, and they file it away. This person won't defend their boundaries. The mirroring phase. This is where psychological predators become most dangerous, and it's rooted in a concept Jung spent his entire career trying to make people understand: projection. In Jungian psychology, projection is the unconscious process of attributing our own qualities, desires, and values onto other people. We do this constantly. We assume others think like we think, feel like we feel, value what we value. Empathetic people project empathy onto others. We assume that people who share with us are sharing for the same reasons we share: to create connection, to be known, to establish trust. We assume that people who seem interested in our lives are interested for the same reasons we're interested in others: genuine care and curiosity. The psychological predator understands this and weaponizes it. They mirror your values perfectly. If you value authenticity, they position themselves as radically honest. If you value loyalty, they emphasize their fierce protectiveness of people they love. If you value depth, they present themselves as someone who's done the work, faced their shadows, integrated their darkness. And because you're projecting your own motivations onto them, you believe it. You think they're showing you who they are. They're not. They're showing you a reflection of who you are, because that's what makes you lower your defenses. Jung called this the persona, the social mask we all wear. But the predator's persona isn't just a mask. It's a strategic tool calibrated specifically to your psychology. Part 3. Stage 2. The isolation, separating you from reality checks. Once a psychological predator has established that you're empathetic, that you accommodate boundary violations, and that you're projecting positive qualities onto them, they move into the second stage, isolation. Carl Jung wrote about this in his analysis of mass psychology and totalitarian movements. But the pattern applies perfectly to individual manipulation. He observed that when people are separated from their community, from alternative perspectives, from reality checks, they become susceptible to belief systems that would otherwise seem obviously false. A psychological predator needs to separate you from the people who would see through them. Here's how they do it. The uniqueness bond. First, they create the narrative that your connection with them is special, rare, and misunderstood by others. They tell you things like, "No one gets me the way you do. People don't understand what we have. You're the only person I can really talk to." To an empathetic person, this feels like deep recognition. Finally, someone sees you. Finally, your capacity for understanding is being valued and appreciated. But Jung would recognize this as the predator creating what he called a participation mystique, an artificial merging where your identity becomes entangled with theirs. When they say no one understands us, they're not describing reality. They're creating a shared narrative that positions everyone outside the relationship as unable to perceive its value. This does something crucial. It pre-frames any concerns others might raise as misunderstanding rather than legitimate warning signs. The subtle criticism of your support system. Predators don't usually attack your friends and family directly. That would be too obvious. Instead, they plant small seeds of doubt. Your friend seems nice, but she's kind of judgmental, isn't she? Your sister doesn't really seem to get you. Your therapist doesn't understand complex trauma the way we do. Each comment is small, deniable, easy to dismiss, but cumulatively they create distance between you and the people who would normally provide perspective. Jung understood this as the predator attacking what he called your auxiliary functions, the other aspects of your personality that balance your dominant empathetic nature. Your friends might use thinking function more than you do. They might see red flags you're rationalizing. They might make judgments based on behavior rather than potential. The predator knows this, so they systematically undermine your trust in those perspectives. The pace acceleration, psychological predators move fast. They want commitment, intimacy, enmeshment before you've had time to observe their behavior over multiple contexts. Within weeks, they're talking about the future. They're making plans. They're creating shared projects, shared goals, shared identities. If it's a romantic relationship, they're using the word love. If it's a friendship or professional relationship, they're creating dependencies. This isn't passion, this is strategy. Jung would recognize this as the predator trying to bypass what he called the transcendent function, your capacity to hold tension between opposites, to observe contradictions, to integrate conflicting information over time. When things move too fast, you don't have time to notice that their words don't match their actions. You don't have time to see them in different contexts with different people. You don't have time to check your perception against reality. Speed is a weapon, and empathetic people are particularly vulnerable to it because we interpret intensity as intimacy. Part 4. Stage 3. The Exploitation. Why you stay. This is the stage where the predator begins to extract what they came for: attention, resources, emotional labor, validation, control. And this is where Carl Jung's concept of the shadow becomes critical to understanding why empathetic people tolerate treatment they would never accept for others. The compassion trap. Here's what happens. The predator begins to reveal their dysfunction. They have a crisis. They have trauma. They have addiction, financial problems, legal issues, dramatic relationship patterns, and each time they reveal another layer of chaos, they frame it as vulnerability, as trust, as letting you in. Your empathetic nature responds exactly the way it's designed to, with compassion, with the desire to help, with the belief that your understanding and support can make a difference. But Jung would ask you a critical question. Whose shadow are you actually dealing with? In Jungian psychology, the shadow is the unconscious part of the personality that contains everything we've rejected, denied, or failed to integrate about ourselves. Everyone has a shadow. The psychological work of individuation, becoming whole, requires acknowledging and integrating the shadow rather than projecting it outward. When an empathetic person encounters a psychological predator, something complex happens. You're not just responding to their dysfunction, you're unconsciously engaging with your own shadow material. Stay with me here, because this is where it gets uncomfortable. Empathetic people often carry what Jung would call an inflated identification with the light, with goodness, understanding, forgiveness, compassion. We're the helpers, we're the healers, we're the ones who see the good in others when no one else does. But that identification creates a shadow, the parts of us that are capable of selfishness, of judgment, of walking away, of saying, "This isn't my responsibility." Those parts get rejected and pushed into the unconscious. When you encounter someone deeply dysfunctional, they represent your shadow material. They're acting out the parts of you that you've deemed unacceptable. The selfishness, the boundary violation, the refusal to meet others' needs, the entitlement. And unconsciously, you try to save them as a way of saving those rejected parts of yourself. You try to prove that even the darkest parts of a person deserve love and acceptance, because you're really trying to prove that about yourself. This is the compassion trap. You're not staying because they're getting better. You're staying because leaving would force you to confront your own capacity to be selfish, to prioritize yourself, to refuse to carry someone else's dysfunction. Psychological predators don't treat you badly all the time. If they did, you'd leave. Instead, they use what behavioral psychology calls intermittent reinforcement, unpredictable cycles of good treatment and bad treatment that create the strongest form of psychological conditioning. Jung didn't use this language, but he understood the principle through his concept of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites. In relationships with predators, this happens constantly. Cruelty becomes kindness, neglect becomes attention, criticism becomes praise. And because empathetic people are wired to respond to emotional data, each moment of good treatment feels like evidence that the person is changing, that your compassion is working, that the relationship is worth fighting for. But here's what's actually happening. You're being conditioned. The unpredictability creates anxiety. The anxiety makes you hypervigilant to their emotional state. The hypervigilance makes you work harder to manage their moods, anticipate their needs, avoid triggering their dysfunction. You're no longer in a relationship. You're in a hostage situation disguised as intimacy. By this stage, you've invested enormous amounts of time, energy, and emotional labor into this person. You've defended them to friends and family. You've made sacrifices. You've restructured your life around their needs. The rational part of you, Jung's thinking function, would say, this investment has produced no return. Cut your losses and leave. But the empathetic part of you, the feeling function, says, but I've invested so much. If I leave now, it means all of that was wasted. If I leave now, I'm abandoning them. If I leave now, I'm giving up on someone who needs me. Jung would identify this as another shadow issue. Empathetic people often carry a shadow fear of being revealed as selfish, as giving up, as not being as compassionate as they claim to be. The predator knows this. They leverage your sunk costs. They remind you of all the times you promised to stay, all the ways you've claimed to understand them, all the evidence that you're not like other people who abandon them when things get hard. And you stay. Not because the relationship is good, but because leaving would force you to face your own shadow, the part of you that's capable of walking away from someone in pain. Part 5, Stage 4, the revelation, when you finally see. There comes a moment, sometimes after months, sometimes after years, when the illusion breaks. Carl Jung called these moments enantiodromia, the sudden reversal into the opposite. The moment when everything you believed about this person inverts and you see them clearly for the first time. This doesn't usually happen because of one dramatic betrayal. It happens because of accumulated micro-betrayals that finally exceed your capacity to rationalize them. Your thinking function, the one that's been suppressed and overridden by your feeling function throughout this relationship, suddenly comes online with full force. And when it does, you don't just see what this person is doing now. You see the entire pattern stretching backward through time. You realize the boundary violations weren't accidents. They were tests. You realize the vulnerability wasn't intimacy. It was manipulation. You realize the mirroring wasn't connection. It was camouflage. You realize the crises weren't bad luck. They were patterns of dysfunction that will never change. Jung wrote about this moment in his work on Individuation. It's the stage where you confront the reality of the other person's shadow without the filter of your projections. You stop seeing their potential. You start seeing their patterns. And it's devastating. Not just because you've been manipulated, but because you have to confront how long you participated in your own deception, the shame spiral, and why it's actually healthy. When empathetic people finally recognize they've been hunted and exploited, the first emotion is often shame. How did I not see this? How could I be so stupid? Why did I tolerate this for so long? But Jung would say, this shame is your psyche trying to individuate. Shame, in this context, is the signal that you violated your own knowing. At some level, probably many levels, you did see the red flags. You did sense the manipulation. You did know something was wrong. But you overrode those perceptions because acknowledging them would have required you to do something uncomfortable. Set a boundary, walk away, prioritize yourself, disappoint someone, be seen as judgmental or unforgiving. The shame you feel now is proportional to how many times you betrayed your own intuition to maintain the relationship. And that shame, as painful as it is actually the beginning of integration. Jung's concept of integration means taking back the projections, acknowledging that this person isn't who you wanted them to be, acknowledging that you participated in creating the illusion, acknowledging that your empathy, divorced from boundaries, became a weapon used against you. This isn't self-blame, this is self-awareness, and it's the only path to making sure this pattern doesn't repeat. Here's what happens when you start to see clearly. The predator escalates. They don't accept your new boundaries. They don't respect your distance. They cycle through what people in abuse recovery call hoovering, attempts to suck you back into the dynamic. First, they love bomb. They become the person they were during the initial approach, attentive, vulnerable, remorseful, promising change. When that doesn't work, they guilt trip. They remind you of your commitments, your compassion, your claims to understand them. When that doesn't work, they attack. They tell you you're cold, you've changed, you're abandoning them just like everyone else. You were never really empathetic. You were just pretending. And here's where Jung's understanding of the shadow becomes critical for your protection. All of those accusations are projections of their own shadow material. They're not describing you, they're describing themselves. The coldness, the manipulation, the performance of connection, that's them. They're projecting it onto you as a last-ditch attempt to make you question your perception and return to the fog. Don't. Part 6. The integration. What Jung would tell you now. If Carl Jung were sitting across from you right now, after you've recognized that you were hunted, exploited, and betrayed by a psychological predator, here's what he would say. Your empathy isn't the problem. Your lack of integration is. Let me explain what he means. Empathy, in its mature form, includes the capacity for discernment. It includes the wisdom to recognize when compassion enables destruction. It includes the strength to withdraw your energy from people who weaponize your care. The empathy that got you into this situation wasn't mature empathy. It was what Jung would call unconscious empathy. Empathy driven by your own unintegrated shadow needs rather than genuine care. You weren't just caring for this person, you were proving your goodness to yourself, avoiding the discomfort of being seen as selfish, acting out your savior complex, staying in the relationship to avoid feeling your own pain, using their dysfunction to avoid facing your own. That's not empathy. That's codependence dressed in spiritual language. Real empathy, Jung would say, requires what he called differentiation, the ability to feel someone's pain without taking it on as your own, the ability to understand someone's trauma without making it your responsibility to heal, the ability to witness someone's dysfunction without trying to fix it. Here's the work you have to do now. Integrate your shadow relationship with boundaries. Empathetic people often carry a shadow belief that boundaries are unkind, that saying no is selfish, that protecting yourself means you don't really care about others. But Jung would say the opposite is true. Without boundaries, empathy becomes enmeshment. Without discernment, compassion becomes enabling. Without self-protection, care becomes self-destruction. The psychological predator in your life taught you, at enormous cost, that boundaries aren't optional. They're not something you can skip because you're evolved or understanding. They're the container that makes real connection possible. When you have strong boundaries, you can be genuinely empathetic because you're not in danger of being consumed. When you have discernment, you can offer compassion to people who will receive it without weaponizing it. Jung's concept of individuation, becoming whole, requires that you integrate both your capacity for connection and your capacity for separation, both your empathy and your discernment, both your compassion and your self-protection. The predator didn't destroy your empathy. They revealed where it was unintegrated, where it was being driven by unconscious needs rather than conscious choice. Now you get to build it back, this time integrated with wisdom. Here's what that looks like practically. First, trust your body's signals. Empathetic people often override their physiological responses because we're trained to rationalize everything. But your body knows. When someone violates a boundary, your nervous system registers it before your mind rationalizes it away. That tightness in your chest, that heaviness in your stomach, that subtle recoil, trust it. Second, interrogate your own motivations. When you find yourself desperately trying to help someone, ask yourself, am I helping them, or am I trying to prove something about myself? Am I responding to their need, or am I avoiding something in my own life? Third, accept that you cannot save people from themselves. Jung was clear about this. Individuation is a solo journey. You cannot do someone else's shadow work. You cannot integrate their rejected parts for them. You cannot want their wholeness more than they want it themselves. Your empathy is a gift, but it's only a gift when it's offered from wholeness, not from wound. If you've watched this far, you're probably recognizing patterns from your own life. Maybe you're still in a relationship with a psychological predator. Maybe you just got out. Maybe you're years into recovery, and this video is confirming what you've slowly been realizing. Wherever you are in the process, understand this. Carl Jung believed that the psyche has an inherent drive toward wholeness. Your unconscious brought you into this situation because there was something you needed to learn about yourself, something about your shadow, your boundaries, your unintegrated parts. That doesn't make the predator's behavior your fault, but it does make your healing your responsibility. The psychological predator taught you where you were undefended. Now you get to build those defenses, not as walls that keep everyone out, but as conscious boundaries that protect your energy while allowing real connection with people who've earned it. You're not broken because you were hunted. You were hunted because you're powerful. Because empathy is power, and predators are drawn to power they can exploit. The question now is, what do you do with that power? Jung would say, integrate it, own it, build boundaries around it, use it consciously instead of unconsciously, offer it to people who reciprocate rather than extract. Your empathy isn't the problem, it never was. The problem was empathy without wisdom, compassion without discernment, care without self-protection. Now you know better, and knowing better means you get to do better, not by becoming less empathetic, but by becoming more integrated. That's the path forward. That's the work. That's how you make sure the hunt ends here. If this video resonated with you, the algorithm will show you more content that helps you understand the psychological patterns that shaped your life. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And if you're ready for the next layer of this work, watch my video on how psychological predators hunt empathetic people, where we go deeper into Carl Jung's insights.